Hello, everyone, and welcome to the BYU Family History Library webinar series. We're glad you could join us today. I'm Megan Smith, and I'll be your host for this webinar. If you have technical difficulties during the webinar, please use the chat box and I can address your concerns. You are welcome to use the chat box during the webinar for comments, insights, and questions. However, all questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. Our next webinar is on September 17th with Maureen Brady. If you would like to access a previous webinar, please visit our webinar index on our website or search on our YouTube channel. All of our webinars are recorded and uploaded by the following Monday for your convenience. We also post links to recordings and other updates on our Facebook and Twitter accounts. For today's webinar, we are pleased to hear from James Tanner, who will be talking about using full-text search to research your enslaved ancestors. Before we begin, here's a little bit about our speaker. James has over 43 years' experience in genealogical research and is an avid blogger of Genealogy's Star blog. He has served as a family history volunteer for 21 years and has presented at expos and conferences around the US, Canada, and Europe. He is a member of the board of directors of the Family History Guide Association and is currently serving at the BYU Family History Library. James is a professional photographer and has 7 children, 34 grandchildren, and 4 great-grandchildren. And if James is ready, we'll turn the time over to him.
Okay. Well, I'd like to welcome everyone to another webinar from the BYU Library Family History Center. I guess we'll start right in with this. We're talking today about using full-text search to research your enslaved ancestors. Kind of a little bit of introduction here because it's important to get some perspective. One of the most difficult areas to research in the United States can be summarized in saying enslaved ancestors, because they were property. They weren't considered to be people, and they had almost zero rights at all. And it was and information recorded about them was, in a sense, incidental to their enslavement. And so this is one of the most challenging areas that you can be involved in. As to how it's being done today, all I can say is that the developments that we have, primarily caused by the tremendous technical surge in artificial intelligence, or AI, has opened up a whole new area of research for your enslaved ancestors. And knowing about this is extremely important because the information now is coming out in larger quantities than it has ever in the past. So let's get into it here a bit. I'm going to have to give a little bit of history here, and I think that it's helpful to have the perspective that we're talking about. So the first enslaved Africans brought to the English-occupied North America arrived in Virginia in August 1619 at Point Comfort, now part of Fort Monroe National Monument. They were part of a group of enslaved people stolen from a Spanish ship by English privateers and traded to colonists for supplies. So we date enslavement in the U.S. clear back to early colonial times. And it's sometimes we have in our minds, and because of the way that history is presented and written, we get the idea that enslaved people were mainly in the South. But in the early days, there were enslaved people including New England. And so it's almost any state where we can find people and their descendants are spread out throughout the United States. This is the the grasp of the time period. We talk about the initial year, 1619, and now we're going to flash forward to Matilda, excuse me, Matilda McCreer, the last known survivor of the last U.S. slave ship. So this was a person that was brought to America as a slave, and she died in 1940, 75 years after slavery was abolished. She was a child when she arrived in Alabama in 1860 aboard the slave ship, the Clotilda. So we have this huge spectrum of people whose history is obscured by their enslavement. And so anything that we find, anything that helps us break that barrier creates an opportunity for research and connection that we probably have not had in the past. So now what we're going to do is kind of work into the records. First, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through kind of set the stage and explain how some AI improvements with what we call now full text search and handwriting recognition have opened up a vast library of information, and much of that it gives us a little bit of an open window that we did not have into the history of the enslaved population of America. But we have to understand that much of our genealogical research is still stuck in the paper age. We're still in this transition. Some of us who are using technology extensively every day, involved with all kinds of programs and kinds of technological advances that come weekly and almost daily. It's hard for us to understand that in the vast world of records and the vast world of people who are participating in genealogy, there's still a reliance on paper. So let's see what we do to move somebody along to a new computer-based AI-driven methodology and the advantages of that. So what I would suggest is that if you know people, once you understand how technology has affected the research, it becomes incumbent on each person who understands that to make an effort to communicate the advantages of learning about this full text search and handwriting recognition and how that affects the research that's being done on African American history. Here's the fundamental idea. And the reason why this idea is fundamental is that it determines where and how we obtain the information from the records and what records were kept. And so we're looking at a specific type of record that has to do with personal property rights. And we need to understand that enslaved people were property. They're the same thing as a car or a boat or a washing machine or anything that you presently might have ownership of that is considered your personal property as opposed to your real property, which would be what you owned if you owned land or anything attached to or part of the land, like a house. So because of the reality of the fact that they were property, they could be bought, sold, gifted, and inherited. And that means that there were records created, which in some instances can be invaluable in getting there and obtaining information about the enslaved people. And let's say in the more recent past, just a few very short years ago, the main issue about enslaved people was that going back before 1860, which was the first census, and a few earlier census records um, called the slave schedules, it was very difficult and sometimes impossible to trace a family or an individual back past that kind of hard brick wall that existed. But now we're going to go see that the technology has now enabled us to pierce that brick wall in a to some extent. It's not completely free ride, but it is a important development. And understanding also that most of the valuable records about enslaved people are handwritten and they're not indexed and they're not um, still not digitized. There are literally millions of records sitting in archives across the United States that are waiting to be digitized. In 2018, my wife and I spent the year in Annapolis, Maryland, working with for Family Search as church service missionaries, digitizing records, primarily probate records for the Maryland State Archives. We basically, there were 5 cameras working and had a volunteer staff helping to prepare the documents and papers of about 30 people. And all of that was going on. And during that year, we estimated that we probably digitized well over 2 million records. But in reality, what we did was only only scratched the surface of what was available from the Maryland State Archives. It just barely got it started. And even though the digitizing is ongoing, and it's now been going on for those many years since 2018 and before, there are still millions of records. And the value of the records is that they have opened up a tremendous number of records dealing with enslaved people. And part of what I'm going to do today is kind of outline and indicate all the different kinds of records that are going to become available for what we're calling full text search. So Family Search, full text search, by the way, has been around for, it was first used by IBM in computer systems that they were creating many, many years ago, back in the infant days of computers. But full text search as a way of opening up genealogically important documents is a rather recent development. If you think about books, if you go to a website like archive.org or go to Google's books section where they have their digital books, or if you go to any place where digitized books are available, you probably think just obviously that you could search every word in those books, and that's probably been going on for a long time. But the step had to be taken to add the capability of doing those kinds of searches to generally to genealogically important documents, those held by Family Search, Ancestry, MyHeritage, all the other websites. And Family Search has been at least in the forefront of creating this kind of access to direct access to the records through what's called full text search. So here's the definition. A full text search is a method of searching for information within an entire content of a document or a collection of documents rather than just specific fields or metadata. Metadata, if you're not aware, is data that has been extracted in the sense like an index. An index is sort of like metadata. Metadata is a way of giving you of presenting the topics or subjects matters or place the records came from or all the information about the record itself. Um, and it's important to have that because it's part of how we identify the documents. And full text search involves analyzing all the words in the text to find your user's search. So you can search for a single name. If it were distinct enough, you would probably find it almost instantaneously in the entire collection of records. And this differs from the traditional searches that might only look at the titles, abstracts, or specific keywords. So if you spend any time indexing records for Family Search, the way that you indexed was to extract certain fields for the records, like given name, surname, the outline number of fields that you were looking at was far from the total record, and basically ignored, in a sense, the rest of the information. And when you're trying to find a specific individual, which is part of what we do as genealogists in doing research, the issue, of course, was that the index name could have been misindexed. It may have been skipped. It may not have been able to be read in the text. The person we're searching for may never have been the primary person in a document. They were always kind of secondary, and they're listed in a document like a will, or they're listed in a document like a deed, or they're listed in a probate file where the property was transferred after the death of a person. And all of these areas were subject to some level of indexing, even if it was a superficial index. And we still found ourselves, and still will until all of this development completes its saturation of all the documents in the FamilySearch.org website. We still find ourselves looking page by page through documents for our ancestors and relatives' names. So what Family Search what Family Search's full text search is adding is the capability to remove that entirely. In other words, as soon as the document is subject, or the collection of documents is subject to both handwriting recognition, OCR, optical character recognition, and full text search, there is no longer any reason to go through the documents page by page. You can search every word in every document. And what that does is it frees us from paper entirely. So now we don't have to worry about looking through the paper, turning pages. We can simply worry about how to um, prepare or say our searches, create what they call prompts, the way we communicate with the machine. And it's very straightforward. It usually starts with just names and places and dates, but it basically becomes another topic in the search for information. So this is one thing that happened just recently. This is the last couple of weeks, actually. Um, for most of the time, the Family Search full text search was in the labs, LABS labs section under FamilySearch.org/labs. And just through 2 or 3 weeks past, the full text search moved to the main search tab even on the startup page of Family Search. So now if you click on search, you'll get the drop down, which has records. Now it says full text search. and images, family tree, genealogies, catalog books, and research wiki, cemeteries, and newspapers. So if you're still learning and acquainted with family search, one of the things that is probably the first or few things that you should do involves going down this search and understanding what each one of those entries are. And more important than anything else in that list presently, in my opinion, is learning how and why full text searches are so important. So here's what happens when you do a full text search. In this particular case, I searched for simply Mississippi just to see what kinds of records were probably available from Mississippi. That's something you can do. You could put in an exact place like a town or a county, and it will search all of the records, every digitized record that has been run through full text search. And there are millions and millions of these being converted every day of the week. And as the computers just keep running, and they are processing these and reading all of the insert, and they're transcribing all of the handwriting into um, searchable text. So in this case, it pulled up Mississippi freedmen's records, military records, and a long list of other records that were available. So I was looking here at one of those records, the Mississippi Freedmen's Bureau record in 1865 to 1869. This is a valuable set of records that occurred after the Civil War, and it was a way to try to mitigate the effects of enslavement, but lasted only a very short time before uh, the, uh, the what happened in the South, that they the enslaved people lost much of the ground that they had gained uh, by the by the liberation in the Civil War. So what you have here now is a document that came up, and you could, if you were, if you're experienced like I am, it'd take me a couple of minutes to get used to that handwriting, and then I would be able to read this completely through. But that's not the case. And it can sometimes be as a document I'm struggling with, which happens to be in Italian, not in English. And the handwriting is so bad and the copy is so bad that it's very, very hard to read. But this will be the transcription of the record is now here on the right-hand side. So what it says and all of the information that's on there that starts off with the page number, and then it comes, uh, it reads as what he looks like, uh, what it looks like to the computer. Now, I mentioned the fact that we were involved, a lot of us involved over the years in indexing records. Well, the indexing program from Family Search has ended some almost a year ago. It is gone. And right now, the new volunteer effort is going and looking at the text that has been transcribed, the handwritten text, which has been transcribed by the computer, and making the corrections that are necessary. So basically, if you looked at this and you read what it said, you would be able to make the changes within this program. That's the review program. It's still under the get involved portion of FamilySearch.org. So if you've been getting involved in indexing, you can just switch over easily to this. And I can tell you what, it's very much easier in the sense of it's not quite as much of a challenge as indexing, and it's a lot faster, and you can get a lot more done. And so people are really able to help and get these records, get the transcription records, uh, let's call it corrected, and made even more importantly, made it more searchable. In other words, it's more things that you can, the more accurate it is, the more likely it is that you will find the record you're looking for. So this is what comes up when you put in a search and start clicking on the documents. And what you searched for will be highlighted. So there's uh, a transcription that can be searched. The answer is also, you see the little icons up there at the top. You can download the transcript and you can save the transcript and you can actually look at it and at the same time. So what this means is that handwriting recognition and full text search open a whole new world of documents about enslaved people. These are the ones that there's all sorts of these documents out there. And if we go looking at the documents here, these are the types of records that are available to be processed. And each of these records, the record sets here, the collections, if you will, of these records are records that contain or probably contain, if during the time periods, uh, contain information about enslaved people. We start off with estate and probate records, and the reason why both estate and probate records are important for African American research is that they contain information about the property owned by the deceased person. And so when a slaveholder died, the property that he owned or she owned became were put into the court proceeding called probate, and there was an inventory taken and an assessment taken of uh, the value of the property. While we were at the Maryland State Archives, we were exclusively looking at probate records, almost exclusively. They also included some indenture records and other things that were related. It was actually records from what's called the Orphans Court of Maryland. And getting the probates records, basically after we had just been there not too long doing the scanning of these records, taking photographs of the records every day, we began to get wrapped up, all of us, in the issue of the inventories. And the reason there was the inventories were that there were people in the inventories, the African American enslaved people, who were listed as property. And it was heartbreaking and very emotional experience. We basically, just in order to do our work, sometimes we had to just kind of block it out and not read all the stuff because it was so made us feel so bad. But what we have here also are deeds of sale, bills of sale, deeds of gifts, tax records, court records, apprenticeship and indenture records. It's interesting, or not interesting, it's a tragedy. It's a tragedy that at the end of the Civil War, when the people were enslaved, were, say, freed from their enslavement, many of them were forced by the circumstances and the culture in the South, particularly, that they were signing in as indentured. So they end up being in almost the same category as an enslaved person, even though they had been given freedom. Registers, census, slave schedules, I mentioned that, and the post-Civil War censuses from 1870 onward. Then we have the Freedmen's Bureau records. If you aren't familiar with any of these records, I would encourage you to look at the list. If you're watching this as a video online, uh, I would suggest you stop the video and do a screenshot of this and make sure that you, if you're doing African American research, understand the content and availability of the records that are listed here as pertinent to African American and enslaved person research. And here's the promise of family search and the promise of a full text search is that all of these records will eventually be fully searchable. So if you imagine this, all these records having been passed through the handwriting recognition and OCR recognition and turned into text files, and then having the ability to search all these records at the same time for every word, you can begin now to understand the the power and the importance of what is happening here in making available ancestral records that have been closed books. Uh, uh, I can. It's I have been through the circumstances of the many years that I've been doing genealogical research. I've spent days, weeks in the libraries and looking through microfilm page by page by page, looking for records. And now to jump into this technology where I can sit at my own computer at home and work through trying to find, you know, search terms that will help me. But after I'm pretty well versed on that, having done Google searches for years and years, but um, using some of the same terms and same processes for Google searches and using alternate names and alternate spellings and all the other things that go with that, and being able to turn up records that are amazing. So we'll just look at a little bit of that. And now I'm going to go through some of the records and show you what they look like. In other words, what the types of records now that are going to be searchable and going to be available through full text search. And first of all, and probably most important, are the probate records. And so, as I mentioned a moment ago, when the slaveholder died, their will and estate records would often list enslaved people by name, sometimes with their age, always, sometimes always in an estate, the value of the slave. Heart-rending to see an individual, someone named something like Old Joe, and his value was 25 cents. And you just can't imagine that a person had so little value in that culture. Or family relationships. In other words, all of this can come out in a probate record, and they're what we would call dense handwritten records, and they're done in a narrative fashion, and each probate is unique. And so there's really no standard. The formats are the same levels. You have to go through the same process called the probate through according to the probate law of the state that they were involved in, or the colony. And the probate records are all going to be similar structured, but the information is always going to be different, and it's not all, and there's different information for each person. So they are very difficult to research page by page when you're looking for uh, only a specific person or a specific family. But when you have full text search, all that opens up and you're able to get into these records. Deeds of sale, bills of sale, and deeds of gift. These are all records that are part of the records that now are going to be opened up. So in this case, it's on a standard form, but the form itself has information about a specific enslaved person. And in this case, there's a name, and if the researcher knows the name, this record will be immediately discoverable. Just a kind of a word here about taxes, because there were taxes on enslaved people as a major source of revenue. That does not mean that the tax that the enslaved person paid the tax. The owner of the enslaved person paid the tax the same as you would pay a tax on your car, or pay a tax on your home, or pay a tax on buying property at the store. So if you go into a store and you pay sales tax, that's the kind of tax that was put on enslaved people, not on them, not on them paying the tax, them being the property that was being taxed. So the early colonies taxed enslaved people on their arrival. Property taxes, they were considered personal property and valued and by the state. So if you own a home or if you own a car, you may get a tax notice once a year from the government saying you have to pay your tax on your home, on your real estate tax, and you also have to pay on your car. Well, in this case, if you were a slave owner, you would get a statement from the county or the state that said your tax this year is against all of your slaves is this. So that would be the way that worked. And added value taxes are often based on the estimated value of the enslaved people. And it was in the planters' interest to limit these taxes. So there was always a fight going on over uh, the added value tax. Uh, the the issue here would be the same thing if you own a piece of property and you build a house on it, then your house is taxed, and that's the way that you get into that level. And then there's 3/5 clause, which was one of the kind of the really bad part of the enslaved people process is the U.S. Constitution said that enslaved people were as 3/5 of were counted as 3/5 of a person for taxation and congressional representation purposes. And that included the power of the slaveholding states, but it granted no rights to the enslaved people. So the fact that they were mentioned in the Constitution didn't mean anything. All it meant was that the enslaved owners could count their slaves for taxation and congressional representation, even if they were property. Okay, court records. Now you could get into things where, let's call it even more, let's say, of a blocking major of, of gathering information is to dig into court records, because court records have literally no organization at all, and can be as an attorney that as a trial attorney, I worked for 39 years as a trial attorney. I can tell you right now, there's absolutely no logic or commonality between different court records. And so it's not going to help you to know how one record set of court records goes and then move to a different court. You may have a completely different organization and a completely different set of records. And so opening up all the court records to full text search from the standpoint of family search has basically there may be legal disputes over enslaved people. It may contain manumissions, which were the act of the slave owner freeing the slave, and other pleadings. So that just like any other property in the United States, there's at some point there seems to be litigation about that property. Apprenticeships, I mentioned this already briefly. Um, it was unfortunate that what I saw in the records in Maryland were that even after slavery ended, that the free African Americans were often involved in indentures, ostensibly to learn a, a way to make a living, but on the other side of it, they were still as controlled and still under the ownership of the contract ownership of the person owning the indenture. census records. This is a copy of the slave schedules, one of the slave schedule pages from 1850. And this one would tell and is sometimes the jumping off point for beginning research into an enslaved family. Freedmen's Bureau records, there's a variety of these records. There's quite a few of these records. If you're not familiar with the Freedmen's Bureau, then this is probably a place to start getting information. If you needed to get started quickly, what I would suggest is looking on Family Search in the Research Wiki, which is under the Search tab, and looking at the records that are available. Going to a search, just look for Freedmen's Bureau records in the wiki, and there will be a very good entry-level explanation of the records that are available and where they're available. And these are, over again, these are records that were almost impenetrable from doing a search standpoint, even though some of them were being indexed and there was indexes that were being made. The indexes are sometimes misleading because if you go in and index it and you don't find anything, then you may believe that the person you're looking for, the family you're looking for, was never in there. But the question would always be which of the fields were indexed and to what extent on a record like this, for example, were all the names indexed and all the dates and all the places associated with each other? And the answer may or may not be true. In other words, you'd have to go see what was there. You don't have to worry about that so much anymore if, in fact, these records get processed into full text search. Military records, there were the colored troops in the U.S. Army and the Navy during the Civil War. And once again, there's these records are they're kind of what we call, they're dense records. They have a lot of information, but they're also dense in the sense that they take a tremendous amount of research to break through and use the records for genealogical purposes. And having them reviewed by the AI and identifying all the names and transcribing the names and all the other information of making it available makes these records not fully transparent, but makes them tremendously more valuable and useful in the research. Now, this flyer here would be searchable, perhaps even now, if it had been indexed. But if it's not has not been indexed, then it's not available. What the free full text search will do is will index, in a sense, by reading all these documents, every word in this document. So you could start looking for the names of the people here. You could also find all the information of all the by place and by date and by everything else in this record. Now, this was at the beginning of the full text search that was a little over 2 years ago. With Family Search, the first 2 sets of records they did were deeds, actually 3 sets, deeds, probate records, and the plantation records. And with those 3 sets, the organizations, the genealogical societies, African American genealogical societies, were able to begin their research. And there were initially hundreds and hundreds of people who were found that had been the subject of research for many, many years. It was a transformational experience, and it's ongoing. And as more and more of these records get processed, then this amount of information will also be transmitted. family Bibles and papers. Um, these are documents that, for the most part, are on the margin of being full text searched. In other words, they're not documents that have had every word, and every line, and every person indexed. And even if the index had kept going full steam from the time in Family Search, it was estimated that the amount of records never exceeded a third of the records on Family Search. So regardless of what was happening back then with before full text search, uh, 2/3, possibly more, of the records on Family Search were unsearchable. You had to find the record, you had to look at the record, and you had to go through the record to find them. And family Bibles are documents that are being put into digital files. Some of the large collections of Bible records have already been indexed completely, but others are still sitting out there waiting to be processed. Another thing is, and this is something that's happening big with Ancestry and MyHeritage, and Ancestry and MyHeritage both have companies that are that separate from their main company. So with Ancestry.com, the newspaper portion is in newspapers.com, and with MyHeritage, the newspapers are in oldnews.com. On both websites, there are some newspapers that are included. And although you may not realize it, but there are a lot of newspapers that are on Family Search also. And now they will be subject to this full text search. In addition to that, there are a huge number of free websites for newspapers that are also completely searchable by full text search. The Library of Congress began a project called Chronicling America, and in that project, they sponsored the formation of newspaper websites in each of the states. So every state has its own website with digitized newspapers. All you need to do is look for Ohio digitized newspapers, and you'll find the references directly. And these are free websites, and and a lot of those records are in newspapers.com, for example, but they don't bother to tell you that they're free. They are on the website they are too, because some of them fall into public domain. And so there are searchable records on free searchable records on newspapers.com. Church and cemetery records, and they include both white and black congregates, and they're the archives. And surprisingly, I guess it's not somewhat commonly known among genealogists, because when I mention this, people are kind of always amazed. The churches have archives. Obviously, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has a huge archive in Family Search and in the church archives, the church library archives. Other churches do too. The Baptist Church has archives, and you can go out and search for the records. The records that the church records that are on FamilySearch.org are also going to be full text searched. So once again, it'll open up another area of records where we've had to look page by page for information. And just for information's sake, one of the initial attempts at doing the processing of the full text records from Family Search was English records, English language records, and Spanish language records. So many of the records that are on in Latin America are also being processed into full text search. perhaps if you've been involved in the African American research for any period of time, you may be able to see that uh, you may know about the WPA's slave narratives collection that were done in the 1930s. And these are accounts and stories of the formerly enslaved people. And there's uh, another very emotional experience is to listen to the recordings, the actual recordings, the audio recordings of these formerly enslaved people. And those are on the Library of Congress website. So you can look for that under Born in Slavery, the Slave Narratives from the Federal Writers Project in 1936 to 38. There is a database called Voyages, and that's from a project of that identifying the vessels, the places, and the people, and the movement of the slave ships across the Atlantic. And there's a lot of information in this particular website. Once again, it's something you can just look for that says the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database or Voyages and Slave Voyages. And then you would have this is a website that you may want to be aware of. And I'm kind of getting out into other areas of databases such as enslaved.org, and they want to link to scattered records. So full search text is not, Family Search is not the only organization company, if you want to look at it that way, that is involved in making these records more and more available. But as the technology continues to advance, a lot of these other records will start to be made available out there, and the research will become much more complete. There are books about slavery, and once the books are digitized, that makes them fully searchable. And so if there is a book, then that's there. These are books that you can find usually on Google, unless they're still in copyright, and they're probably full text searchable. This book on the right is by my daughter, Amy Tanner Theriot. When researching, it's important to keep in mind that many records are held at the local and state record, and it's also often that you can find them by researching the slaveholder and their property records. So identifying the person, the slaveholder person, sometimes opens up. Remembering that you can search now the records on Family Search that have already been processed by the slaveholders' names and the plantation names and the anything, overseers' names, anything that was associated with it. And so the idea here is to keep learning and keep searching. What I tell the missionary volunteers in the library is that they should basically keep doing their searches every week or two, because of the millions of records that are being processed by this full text search process every day. And so you never know when it's actually going to show up and be available. Okay. Well, thanks for watching. Any questions out there? I think there's one Q&A.
Oh, yeah, it looks like
Are
you're
there
right.
some states where it's easier to find slave records than others? Not really. But I'm assuming that slave states like Maryland, it's going to become easier to find the slave records, especially since they're digitizing all their records. The digitizing effort by Family Search and others is, let's just say there are some places in the United States where it's still not very much, still are not very many records that have been digitized.
Thank you so much, James, and thank you all for joining us today. We hope you'll join us for our next webinar on September 17th with Maureen Brady. A recording of this webinar will be made available by next week. You can view that on our YouTube channel or on our website. If you have any comments or questions, you can always email us at fh_webinars@byu.edu or follow our Facebook and Twitter. Thank you and have a wonderful week.